When the suspension bridge collapsed in downtown Seattle, 50 critical patients flooded St. Jude's Hospital in minutes. The chief of surgery, Dr. Aris, cracked under the pressure of a dying VIP patient. The residents froze. That's when the new hire, Claire Donovan, did the unthinkable. She didn't call for help, she took the scalpel. Ignoring protocol, she performed a high-risk thoracotomy right in the corridor, saving the patient with a terrifying level of precision. She saved 20 lives in 2 hours. But her anonymity shattered the moment a military Black Hawk helicopter touched down on the helipad, shaking the ER glass. FBI agent Nathan Kane marched in, not to arrest the screaming doctor but to confront the nurse. The hospital staff watched in horror as they realized the truth. Claire Donovan wasn't there to change bedpans. She was a ghost surgeon the government listed as killed in action 3 years ago. Why would a woman trained to be a ghost step into the spotlight to save one life, knowing it would cost her freedom? And who was on that operating table that made the FBI scramble a tactical team? Before we unlock the file, please subscribe and tell us in the comments, would you break the law to save a life? It was 2 p.m. on a gray Tuesday when the skyline of Seattle changed forever. The sound didn't register as a crash at first. It was a deep, guttural groan, the sound of steel reaching its breaking point, followed by a snap that echoed like a gunshot across the bay. Then came the silence of gravity taking over. The main suspension cables of the bridge whipped through the air, shearing through traffic and concrete alike. In seconds, the structure gave way, sending cars, buses, and pedestrians plummeting into the freezing water below. Concrete dusted the air like snow. The smell of copper, gasoline, and wet asphalt rose from the wreckage instantly. Inside St. Jude's Hospital, the day had been boringly routine. That changed with a single red phone ringing at the charge desk. The nurse who picked it up went pale, her hand trembling as she pressed the receiver against her ear, trying to hear over the sudden burst of static. "Mass casualty," she whispered, the words dropping into the quiet room like a stone. "They're saying, everyone." Chaos didn't arrive slowly, it kicked the doors in. Within 20 minutes, the trauma bay was a war zone. Stretchers clogged the hallways. The air grew hot and heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp tang of antiseptic. Dr. Aris, the chief of surgery, was shouting orders that made no sense. He was a man used to sterile, scheduled surgeries, not the meat grinder of a disaster triage. He stood over a VIP patient, a man with a crushed chest, and hesitated. His hands hovered. He looked at the monitors, then at the door, waiting for a miracle or a transfer team that wasn't coming. The residents watched him, their eyes wide with panic, paralyzed by their leader's fear. The patient was drowning in his own blood. The monitor began the flat, rhythmic whine of cardiac arrest. Time of death. Dr. Aris began, his voice cracking, ready to give up. Then a voice cut through the panic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't frantic. It was cold, flat, and absolute. "Move, or he dies." The entire ER went silent. They turned to see Claire Donovan. She had been at St. Jude's for a month, a generic nurse, who took the night shifts and never spoke about her past. But the woman standing there now wasn't a nurse. Her posture had shifted. Her eyes weren't scanning the room, they were dissecting it. Before Dr. Aris could scream at her insubordination, Claire stepped past him. She didn't ask for the scalpel. She took it. And for the first time in 90 minutes, the shaking in the room stopped. The sound was not an explosion. It was sharper, more final, a concussive crack that seemed to split the gray Seattle sky in two. For the commuters on the Aurora Bridge, time didn't slow down, it simply stopped. One moment, they were idling in the dull, rhythmic frustration of gridlock, watching rain streak against their windshields. The next, the world tilted. The main suspension cable, corroded by years of salt and neglect, sheared from its anchor point. The tension release was violent enough to shatter windows a half-mile away. The bridge groaned, a deep, mournful sound of twisting steel, before gravity claimed its due. The deck dropped. 50 feet of concrete, steel, and rush-hour traffic plummeted into the dark water of the canal below. The impact threw a plume of spray high enough to wash over the decks of passing ferries. Inside the falling cars, screams were silenced by the crushing force of the water. Those lucky enough to be on the sections that merely sloped rather than fell were thrown against dashboards and steering wheels, trapped in a tangled skepticism of metal and glass. 3 miles away, St. Jude's Hospital was aggressively sterile. The air smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Dr. Aris, the chief of surgery, was currently lecturing a third-year resident on the importance of tie knots, his voice carrying the bored arrogance of a man who hadn't faced a true crisis in a decade. In the corner of the trauma bay, Claire Donovan was restocking saline bags. She moved with an efficiency that made her invisible. She didn't slam the cabinets, she didn't drop supplies. She was a ghost in blue scrubs, her eyes fixed on the task, ignoring the petty politics of the floor. She had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being unmemorable. Then the red phone at the charge desk rang. It was a singular, jarring trill that cut through the low hum of the ER. The charge nurse, a veteran named Betty, picked it up with a casual sigh. Claire stopped moving. She didn't turn her head, but her posture locked. She knew that ring. She knew the silence that followed it on the other end meant the dispatcher was taking a breath before delivering a nightmare. Betty's face went the color of old ash. She didn't hang up. She just looked at Dr. Harris. "Mass casualty," Betty whispered, her voice trembling just enough to shatter the room's calm. "The bridge is down. Estimated 50 critical. 5 minutes out." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that prickled the skin. Dr. Harris blinked, the lecture on tie knots forgotten. "Activate the protocol," he said, but his voice lacked the steel required for the command. "Clear the bays. Get everyone down here." The siren started as a distant whine, a mosquito buzzing against the window pane. Within seconds, they grew into a deafening, overlapping wail that seemed to vibrate the very foundation of the building. The double doors of the ambulance bay burst open. The sensory overload was instantaneous. It wasn't just the noise, the shouting of paramedics, the screaming of patients, the clatter of gurney wheels. It was the smell. The metallic tang of arterial blood, the chemical burn of gasoline, and the damp, earthy scent of canal water flooded the sterile corridor. Paramedics rushed in, their uniforms soaked and dark. "Male 40 crushed pelvis," one shouted. "Female, unidentifiable, severe head trauma, BP dropping," yelled another. The triage system collapsed in seconds. There were too many bodies, too much blood. The walking wounded stumbled in behind the gurneys, dazed figures covered in concrete dust, holding broken arms and bleeding scalps. The pristine white floors were tracked with mud and red smears. Claire pressed herself against the wall as a gurney careened past her. She watched the staff. The residents were freezing, eyes wide, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of human suffering. Dr. Harris was shouting, but his eyes were darting around the room, unable to fix on a single target. He was a captain watching his ship take on water, paralysis creeping into his limbs. The hospital had prepared for bus crashes. They had prepared for fires. But they had not prepared for war. And as the second wave of victims poured through the doors, dragging the chaos of the bridge into the sanctuary of the ER, the system broke. The trauma bay had become a slaughterhouse of good intentions. 10 minutes into the mass casualty event, the organized chaos Dr. Harris had called for dissolved into simple, unadulterated panic. The air conditioning system couldn't keep up with the heat of 50 bodies and the manic energy of the staff, leaving the room heavy with the scent of sweat and copper. Dr. Harris stood at the center of the storm, a captain clutching the rulebook while the ship went down. He was a man who thrived on order, on scheduled elective surgeries and grand rounds where questions had correct answers. But there were no correct answers here, only bleeding ones. "I need a CT scan on bed 4. Harris shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "CT is full, doctor," a nurse yelled back, not bothering to look up from the soldier she was compressing. "There's a line of 3 gurneys in the hall. Then we wait." Harris snapped, wiping sweat from his forehead with a trembling forearm. "We cannot operate blindly on a spinal injury. It's a liability nightmare. Stabilize him and wait for the scan." Claire Donovan heard the order from 3 beds away. She was applying pressure to a jagged laceration on a teenager's thigh, her hands moving with a mechanical, detached rhythm. Wait. The word was a death sentence. She looked over her shoulder. The patient in bed 4, a man in a soaked business suit, was gray. His breathing was shallow, a classic tension pneumothorax building in his chest. Waiting for a scan meant his lung would collapse fully, crushing his heart. In the field, you didn't scan. You decompressed the chest with a needle and kept moving. But this wasn't the field. This was St. Jude's, a cathedral of bureaucracy where protocol was God. "Doctor," a young resident, Miller, stammered, staring at the monitors above a woman whose blood pressure was bottoming out. "She's crashing. I think it's internal bleeding. We need to open her up." Harris spun around, his eyes wide and frantic. "Is the vascular team here yet?" "They're stuck on the I-5. The bridge collapse gridlocked the whole city," Miller pleaded. "We have to do it. You are a second-year resident, Miller. You are not cutting into an abdomen without an attending surgeon present." Eris barked, pointing a gloved finger. Push fluids. Maintain pressure. Do not cut. That is an order. Claire watched the life drain out of the woman's face. It was a slow, quiet fade. The fluids wouldn't help. The tank was leaking faster than they could fill it. The woman needed a clamp, a stitch, a hand inside the cavity to find the bleeder. She didn't need fluids. She needed a surgeon. Around the room, the pattern repeated. Hesitation. Deference to titles that weren't there. Nurses looked to doctors for commands that never came or came too late. The noise of the monitors, that relentless, dissonant pinging, began to synchronize into a singular alarm of failure. Eris was paralyzed by the textbook. He was treating the disaster like a classroom scenario, terrified of making a mistake that would end up in a lawsuit, oblivious to the fact that his caution was filling the morgue. He moved from bed to bed, offering conservative treatments, ordering tests that couldn't be run, and checking his watch as if time were the only enemy he understood. Claire felt the old itch in her hands. It started in her fingertips and worked its way up her arms. A phantom muscle memory of holding a scalpel in the back of a vibrated Humvee, in the dark, with nothing but instinct to guide the blade. She clenched her fist, driving her fingernails into her palm to ground herself. Stay down, she told herself. You're a nurse. You take vitals. You clean wounds. You do not exist. But then the doors swung open again. 2 paramedics rushed in, pushing a gurney that rattled violently. The patient on top was thrashing, fighting the restraints, coughing up bright, frothy blood. John Doe, the paramedic screamed, his voice raw. Found near the center of the span. Impaled object removed on scene by bystanders. He's drowning in his own chest cavity. They slammed the gurney into the trauma bay directly in front of Dr. Eris. The chief of surgery looked down at the man. The patient was huge, muscular, covered in oil and river muck. But it was the injury that made Eris recoil. The man's chest was a ruin, heaving unevenly. He needs a tube. Eris yelled, defaulting to the basics. Get anesthesia. Anesthesia is occupied. Eris froze. The patient bucked, his hand shooting out and gripping Eris's scrub top, leaving a bloody handprint over the doctor's heart. The patient's eyes were wide, terrified, pleading for air that physically couldn't enter his lungs. The resident, Miller, looked at Eris. Dr. Eris, his airway is crushed. We can't tube him. We need to do a cricothyrotomy. Now. Eris stared at the patient's throat. It was swollen, bruised purple and black. The anatomy was gone. To cut there was to cut blind into a mess of cartilage and arteries. Eris swallowed hard, his face pale. He backed away. It's too swollen. We'll hit the jugular. Keep bagging him. Squeeze harder. He's not getting air. Miller screamed, the panic finally breaking his professional veneer. He's dying right now. Claire watched the monitor. The heart rate was plummeting. The oxygen saturation was non-existent. The man on the table was suffocating in plain sight while the chief of surgery debated the risks of intervention. The beep of the monitor slowed. Beep, beep. Eris took another step back. He had choked. The sound of a human being suffocating is distinct. It is a wet, desperate rattle that bypasses the ears and vibrates directly in the reptile brain. In Trauma Bay 1, that sound was fading, replaced by the piercing, singular tone of the cardiac monitor signaling a flatline. Dr. Eris stood frozen, his hands hovering uselessly in the air, palms out as if he could physically push the death away. I can't find the landmarks, he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. The neck is too swollen. If I cut, I'll hit the carotid. We need the vascular team. Where are they? He doesn't have a vascular team, doctor. He has 30 seconds. Miller, the resident, was shouting now, tears of frustration mingling with the sweat on his face. Claire Donovan stood by the crash cart. For 3 years she had been a ghost. She had swallowed her instincts, lowered her eyes, and played the part of the obedient, invisible nurse. She had cleaned bedpans for surgeons who possessed a fraction of her skill. She had stayed silent to stay alive. But the man on the table arched his back, his face turning a deep, mottled violet. His fingers clawed at the air, grasping for oxygen that wouldn't come. Something inside Claire snapped. It wasn't a decision, it was a reflex. The part of her brain that had been dormant, the part trained in the black sites of Kandahar and the safe houses of Damascus, woke up. The noise of the ER faded into a dull hum. Her heart rate didn't spike, it dropped. The tunnel vision set in, crisp and absolute. She didn't run. She walked. Her movement was so fluid, so devoid of the frantic energy consuming the room, that no one registered her approach until she was already inside the sterile field. She stepped between the paralyzed resident and the terrified chief of surgery. "Nurse, what are you doing?" Eris blinked, his eyes losing focus. "Step back. This is a sterile zone." Claire didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on the patient's ruined throat. She reached out, not for a bandage but for the instrument tray. Her hand closed around the handle of a number 10 scalpel. The grip felt heavy, familiar, and dangerous. "Nurse?" Eris's shock turned to indignation. He stepped forward, his ego finally overriding his panic. "Put that down immediately. You are not authorized to." Claire turned. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at Dr. Eris with eyes that were suddenly devoid of any civilian warmth. It was a look that had silenced interrogators and calmed generals. "Move," she said. The room went dead silent. The command hung in the air, heavier than the screams from the hallway. Eris gaped, his face flushing red. "Excuse me? I will have your license for this. I will have you escorted out by security right in." "He has 10 seconds of brain activity left," Claire interrupted, her voice flat, cold steel. She raised the scalpel, the blade catching the harsh fluorescent light. "Move or he dies." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. Dr. Eris flinched. The authority in her voice was so absolute, so terrifyingly professional, that he instinctively took a step back. It was the reaction of a prey animal recognizing a predator. Claire turned back to the patient. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look for the textbook landmarks that Eris had been whining about. She knew the anatomy by feel, by the density of the tissue under her fingertips. She placed her left hand on the man's swollen neck, feeling for the faint vibration of the struggling trachea buried beneath the trauma. She found it. With a motion too fast for the residents to track, she drove the scalpel down. Blood erupted, a dark venous spray that coated her forearm instantly, soaking the sleeve of her blue scrubs. The resident gasped. Eris shouted something unintelligible. But Claire didn't flinch. She wasn't just cutting, she was excavating. The incision was ugly. By the standards of St. Jude's sterile, well-lit operating theaters, it was a mutilation. But Claire wasn't operating for cosmetics. She was operating for air. Blood welled up from the subcutaneous tissue, dark and fast, obscuring the field instantly. Dr. Eris gasped, a wet, horrified sound. "You've severed the thyroid isthmus. He's going to bleed out. Security. Someone get security." Claire didn't hear him. Her world had narrowed down to a 4-inch square of ruined flesh. She dropped the scalpel onto the tray with a metal clatter and didn't wait for a retractor. She plunged her left index finger directly into the open wound, diving blind into the warm, slick mess of the man's neck. Miller, the resident, gagged. This wasn't surgery, it was violence. "I can't see anything," Miller whispered, shaking. "There's too much blood." "I don't need to see," Claire said, her voice a low, vibrating hum. She was palpating the cricoid cartilage, but the anatomy was shattered. The larynx was crushed, a bag of gravel where a structure should be. A standard tube would never pass. She needed a rigid airway, and she needed it 5 seconds ago. "Give me the suction tubing," Claire ordered. The Yankower?" a nurse stammered. "No, the tubing. Cut the tip off. You can't intubate with suction tubing." Eris screamed, moving to grab her arm. "That is non-sterile plastic. You are killing him." Claire didn't look up. She threw her elbow back, a sharp, tactical check that caught Eris in the sternum and knocked the breath out of him. He stumbled back against the crash cart, wheezing. "Cut it," Claire barked. The nurse, terrified, snipped the end of the thick, clear tubing. Claire snatched it. It was improvised, dirty, and something she had done only once before, in the back of a burning APC outside of Damascus. She used her finger, still buried deep inside the man's neck, as a guide rail. She forced the jagged cartilage apart, feeling the sharp edges of the fractured windpipe scrape against her glove. With a wet, sucking sound, she jammed the plastic tubing directly into the trachea. It was a move from the Black Book, the unwritten manual of Special Activities Center medics, techniques designed for when the supply drop misses the zone and you have nothing but grit and garbage. It was brutal. It was fast. And it was completely forbidden in civilian medicine. Claire leaned in, putting her ear to the plastic tube. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the chaotic noise of the ER. Then a hiss. A spray of red mist ejected from the tube as the pressure in the man's chest released. The patient's chest heaved, once violently, then fell into a ragged but rhythmic rise and fall. The monitor, which had been screaming a flat line, beeped. Then again. Beep, beep, beep. The silence that followed was heavier than the panic had been. Claire straightened up. She was breathing hard now, the adrenaline dumping into her system. She looked down at herself. Her left arm, from her fingertips to her elbow, was coated in bright, oxygenated blood. It dripped from her elbow onto the pristine white floor, creating a rhythmic tap-tap-tap in the quiet trauma bay. She looked like a butcher who had just finished a shift. Dr. Aris stared at the tube sticking out of the man's neck. It was crude, held in place by friction and hope, but the oxygen saturation numbers on the screen were climbing. 80%, 85%, 90%. He's stable, Miller whispered, looking from the monitor to Claire with a mixture of awe and terror. How did you know that would work? Claire didn't answer. She grabbed a towel and wiped the worst of the gore from her forearm, but the stain remained, a red badge of the violence she had just enacted. She wasn't trembling. That was what scared Miller the most. Her hands were perfectly steady. Aris pushed himself off the cart. His face was purple with rage, but his eyes were darting to the technique she had used. He had seen tracheostomies. He had seen emergency crikes. He had never seen that. It was military. It was older than military. It was the kind of medicine practiced by people who expected to die before the patient woke up. You, Aris hissed, pointing a shaking finger at her. You're done. You are finished. I don't care if he survived. You assaulted a superior and performed an unauthorized, non-standard procedure. Security is on the way. Claire looked at the patient, ignoring the doctor. She reached down to check the man's pulse one last time. As her fingers brushed his wrist, the sleeve of his tattered shirt pulled back. There, inked on the inside of his forearm, was a tattoo. It wasn't a gang sign. It wasn't decorative. It was a series of numbers and a small, stylized sword wrapped in thorns. Claire's blood ran cold. She knew that symbol. She hadn't seen it since the safe house in Syria. The silence in Trauma Bay 1 was fragile, held together only by the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor. Dr. Aris was already reaching for the wall phone, his face set in a mask of vindictive triumph. He was dialing security, his eyes fixed on Claire with the promise of a career-ending lawsuit. But before he could punch in the final digit, the instrument tray next to him rattled. It was a subtle sound at first, metal shivering against metal. Chink chink chink. Aris paused, receiver in hand. He looked down. The hemostats and forceps were dancing on the stainless steel surface, vibrating as if the room itself were shivering. On the counter, a forgotten cup of lukewarm coffee began to ripple, concentric circles spreading from the center in a frantic, accelerating pattern. Is that an earthquake? Miller asked, looking up at the ceiling tiles. No, Claire said softly. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She felt the vibration in the soles of her feet, a deep, percussive thumping that she hadn't felt since her last rotation in the Helmand province. It wasn't the erratic rumble of an earthquake. It was the rhythmic, chopping beat of horsepower and war. The sound grew exponentially. It went from a vibration to a roar in seconds, a low-frequency pressure wave that pressed against the eardrums. The air in the trauma bay seemed to thicken. Another medevac? A nurse shouted over the rising noise. That's not a medevac, Claire said, her voice barely audible. Medevacs whine. This screams. Outside the large glass bay windows that faced the helipad, the gray afternoon sky suddenly darkened. It wasn't rain. It was a machine. A shadow fell over the emergency room, massive and predatory. The roar became deafening, drowning out the monitors, the shouting doctors, and the distant sirens. The glass walls of the ER bowed inward, flexing dangerously under the immense pressure of the downwash. Then the beast dropped into view. It was a Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk. But it wasn't painted in the friendly reds and whites of the civilian air ambulance service. It was matte black, devoid of reflective surfaces, stripped of any markings save for a faint, gray tail number. It didn't approach with the caution of a hospital transport. It flared hard and fast, a combat landing that prioritized speed over safety. The rotor wash hit the building like a physical blow. Debris from the parking lot, leaves, grit, loose trash, slammed against the windows. The automatic doors at the ambulance bay entrance blew open and stuck there, confused by the wind pressure. What is that? Aris yelled, dropping the phone. He backed away from the window, shielding his eyes as if the helicopter were a bomb about to go off. Why are they landing here? We didn't clear them. Panic, sharp and contagious, ripped through the hospital staff. In a post-disaster city, the arrival of an unmarked military aircraft didn't signal help. It signaled escalation. Code Silver. Lock down, someone screamed from the triage desk. Lock the doors. Nurses and orderlies scrambled away from the windows, ducking behind the counters. Patients who could walk stumbled toward the interior corridors. The fear was primal, the fear of a war zone suddenly manifesting in a civilian sanctuary. The Black Hawk touched down. The wheels hit the concrete with a heavy skid, the suspension compressing under the weight. The rotors didn't spin down. They kept turning, whipping the air into a frenzy, keeping the machine ready for an immediate extraction. Claire didn't move. She stood over her patient, her hand resting on the rail of the gurney. She watched the side door of the helicopter slide open. She saw the dark figures inside, not paramedics in flight suits, but men in full tactical gear, weapons slung low across their chests. She looked down at her bloody arm, then at the tattoo on the patient's wrist. The connection was complete. The bridge collapse wasn't an accident. This patient wasn't a civilian, and she was no longer a nurse. She took a slow breath, tasting the metallic air. The hospital was locking down, sealing the exits to keep threats out. But the staff didn't understand. The threat wasn't outside trying to get in. The threat was already inside, wearing blue scrubs. The automatic sliding doors to the emergency department didn't open. They were forced. With the hospital in lockdown, the magnetic locks had engaged, turning the glass entrance into a barrier. It didn't matter. A gloved hand jammed a pry bar into the seam, and with a screech of metal on metal that rivaled the rotor noise outside, the doors were wrenched apart. The wind from the Black Hawk followed the men inside, blowing papers off the intake desk and scattering sterile wrappers across the linoleum. The team moved like a single organism. There were 4 of them, clad in heavy tactical armor that seemed to absorb the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital. They wore helmets with lowered visors, ballistic vests weighed down with magazines, and they carried short-barreled carbines held at the low ready. The contrast was violent. St. Jude's was a place of soft edges, rounded corners, and hushed voices. It was a world of pastel scrubs and healing. These men were hard angles, Velcro, and steel. They brought the scent of aviation fuel and wet asphalt into the sanitized air, tracking mud over the wax-polished floors. "Hallway clear," the point man shouted, his voice amplified by a throat mic. "Securing the perimeter." They didn't run, they flowed. They swept past the terrified intake nurses who were huddled behind the high counter. They ignored the security guard who had reached for his radio and then frozen, realizing his pepper spray was laughably inadequate against a federal strike team. Dr. Aris, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to regain control of his hospital, stepped out from the trauma bay. "This is a sterile facility," he screamed, his voice cracking. "You cannot bring weapons in here. We have patients." The lead operator didn't even slow down. He simply stiff-armed the chief of surgery, pushing him gently but firmly against the wall as if he were a piece of furniture. "Federal agents. Step aside." Aris sputtered, sliding down the wall, indignity warring with terror. Behind the phalanx of armored operators walked a man who looked different. He wore a windbreaker with FBI emblazoned in yellow on the back, but he moved with the same predatory grace as the soldiers. Agent Nathan Kane didn't have a weapon drawn. He didn't need to. His eyes swept the corridor, processing threats and exits faster than the doctors processed symptoms. He stepped over the threshold of Trauma Bay 1. The room fell silent, save for the mechanical hiss of the ventilator Claire had improvised. The tactical team fanned out, their weapons scanning the corners, their barrels pointing dangerously close to the delicate machinery keeping people alive. The juxtaposition was jarring, the muzzle of a rifle inches from an IV pump, a combat boot resting next to a dropped stethoscope. Kane stopped in the center of the room. He took in the scene, the terrified residents shaking in the corner, the furious Dr. Aris struggling to his feet in the hallway, and the patient on the table with a piece of plastic tubing protruding from his throat. Finally, Kane's eyes landed on Claire. She hadn't moved. She stood by the patient's head, her bloody arm hanging by her side, her face an unreadable mask of calm. She didn't look like the other nurses. She didn't cower. She met Kane's gaze with a level stare that communicated everything and nothing. The operators lowered their weapons slightly, sensing the shift in the room. They weren't clearing a hostile room anymore. They were securing a high-value asset. Kane walked past the patient, ignoring the miraculous, brutal surgery that had just saved the man's life. He stopped 2 feet from Claire. The smell of rain and ozone coming off his jacket mixed with the smell of blood on her scrubs. "Report," Kane said. It wasn't a question. It was a command issued to a subordinate. The nurses gasped. Dr. Aris, now standing in the doorway, looked between the federal agent and the quiet nurse, his brain failing to compute the interaction. Claire didn't blink. Airway compromised. Field cricothyrotomy performed. He's stable for transport. Kane nodded, a sharp, singular motion. He looked at the bloody improvised tube, then back at her. Messy, he noted, his voice low. He's alive, Claire replied. He is, Kane agreed, reaching into his jacket. Which is a problem for you. The silence that had settled over the trauma bay was thin, brittle, and destined to break. Dr. Aris, leaning against the doorframe where the tactical operator had shoved him, watched the interaction between the federal agent and his employee with a growing, suffocating pressure in his chest. He was the chief of surgery at St. Jude's. This was his floor. These were his patients. And Claire Donovan, a woman he had hired 4 weeks ago to check vitals and change dressings, was standing there covered in blood, speaking in shorthand with a man who looked like he toppled governments for a living. The indignity was too much. The fear that had paralyzed Aris moments ago curdled into a blinding, white-hot rage. He pushed himself off the wall, straightening his lab coat with a violent tug. Enough. The shout was guttural, cracking with the force of his hysteria. Aris marched into the center of the room, ignoring the carbines that shifted slightly in his direction. He pointed a trembling finger at Claire, his face flushing a deep, mottled crimson. Officer. Agent. Whoever you are. Aris screamed, his voice bouncing off the glass walls. You want a report? Here is your report. That woman is a criminal. Kane didn't flinch. He didn't even turn his head immediately. He just held up a hand, palm out, a gesture of dismissal that only fueled Aris's fire. Do not silence me. Aris roared, stepping closer, his eyes bulging. Look at what she did. Look at that man's throat. That is not surgery, that is butchery. She is a nurse. She has no license, no authority, and no right to touch a scalpel. The nurses by the station flinched. They had seen Aris angry before, usually over scheduling errors or budget cuts, but they had never seen him like this. He was unraveling, his professional veneer stripped away by the chaos of the last hour. I want her arrested. Aris continued, spitting the words out. He gestured wildly at the bloody instrument tray, then at the plastic tube sticking out of the patient's neck. She assaulted a superior officer. She performed a non-standard, unsterilized procedure on a dying patient. That is malpractice. That is assault with a deadly weapon. Claire stood perfectly still. She didn't look at Aris. She didn't defend herself. She looked bored. That indifference broke him. Aris turned on Kane, invading the agent's personal space. Are you listening to me? She is a rogue nurse. She is a liability. I am the chief of surgery, and I am telling you that this woman is dangerous. Put her in handcuffs right now, or I will have the hospital legal team destroy your career along with hers. The echo of his voice hung in the room. For a second, the only sound was the patient's ragged breathing through the tube. Then Agent Kane turned. The movement was slow, deliberate. He looked at Dr. Aris with the weary patience of a man who had dealt with warlords and terrorists, and found a screaming hospital administrator profoundly unimpressive. Are you finished, doctor? Kane asked. His voice was quiet, a low rumble that carried more weight than Aris's screaming ever could. No, I am not finished. Aris seethed, though he took a half step back. I want her out of my hospital. I want her license revoked. You want to keep your voice down, Kane interrupted. He didn't blink. Because the man on that table isn't just a patient. And she isn't just a nurse. Kane stepped closer to Aris, forcing the doctor to look up. You see a rogue employee, doctor. I see the only person in this entire building who had the clearance, and the capability, to keep that man alive for the last 10 minutes. So, unless you want to explain to the Department of Defense why you tried to stop a classified asset from saving a national security objective, I suggest you step back. Aris's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood drained from his face. Classified asset? He whispered, looking at Claire. Claire finally looked at him. Her eyes were empty of apology. I told you to move, doctor, she said softly. You really should have listened. Dr. Aris was a statue of indignation, his mouth still slightly open, but Agent Kane had already erased him from the equation. To the tactical team, the chief of surgery was now just background noise, static on a secure line. Kane turned his back on the doctor and walked toward the instrument tray. The metal surface was a chaotic landscape of bloody gauze, discarded forceps, and the gleaming number 10 scalpel Claire had used to violate hospital protocol. Kane reached into the inner pocket of his windbreaker and withdrew a manila envelope. It wasn't the pristine, crisp folder of a bureaucrat. It was worn, bent at the corners, and stamped with a red diagonal bar that read "Eyes Only." He tossed it onto the tray. It landed with a heavy, wet slap, settling next to the scalpel. "It's been a long time, Sierra One," Kane said. The call sign hit the room harder than the helicopter landing. The nurses exchanged confused glances. Sierra One? It sounded like a movie script, not something set in a Seattle trauma bay. But Claire didn't look confused. Her posture, already stiff, seemed to lock into place. The civilian mask she had worn for 30 days, the shy, efficient, invisible nurse, slipped completely. She looked at the folder, then up at Kane. Her eyes were cold. "I'm legally dead, Nathan. You signed the certificate yourself." "Paperwork is fluid," Kane replied, his voice devoid of sentiment. "Skill sets are not." Dr. Aris stepped forward, unable to help himself. "Dead? What are you talking about?" "She passed a background check. She has a nursing degree from—" "Forged," Kane said, cutting him off without looking back. "High quality but forged. The woman you hired doesn't exist. The woman standing there hasn't existed since an airstrike in Yemen 3 years ago." Kane gestured to the patient on the table, specifically to the plastic suction tubing protruding from the man's ruined throat. "We weren't tracking you, Claire." "We were tracking him," Kane nodded at the unconscious patient. "But when the bridge went down, we lost his signal. We thought he was dead. Then, satellite telemetry showed a heat signature in this hospital. We assumed it was standard trauma care." Kane leaned in, resting his knuckles on the edge of the gurney. But then the intercept came through. Not a phone call. A biometric update from the patient's watch. His heart rate stabilized. His oxygen levels spiked from lethal to normal in 12 seconds flat. He pointed a gloved finger at the bloody, improvised airway. "That," Kane said softly, "the Damascus loop. Using non-sterile suction tubing to bypass a crushed larynx when a standard kit isn't available. It's not in the textbooks, doctor. It's not in the trauma guidelines. It was invented in a safe house in Syria by a ghost surgeon who ran out of supplies." Kane looked at Claire. "There are only 3 people in the world who know how to seat that tube without severing the jugular. 2 of them are buried in Arlington. You're the 3rd. The room went deathly silent. The residents looked at the plastic tube with new eyes. It wasn't a desperate, clumsy mistake anymore. It was a signature. A fingerprint left in blood. Claire looked down at her hands. They were still stained red. She had known. The moment she took the scalpel, the moment she chose to save the man instead of letting Dr. Aris kill him with hesitation, she had signed her own warrant. She had traded her anonymity for a stranger's breath. "He was dying," Claire said simply. "He is a witness to a biological terror plot," Kane corrected. "And by saving him, you just put yourself back on the active roster." Kane tapped the file on the tray. "The agency doesn't care about your retirement, Sierra. We care that you can do things the American Medical Association considers impossible." He stepped back, his face hard. "We need to move. The people who blew up the bridge aren't done. They know he's here. And now they know you are here." The choice wasn't really a choice. Claire knew that. In the world she had left behind, the world of redacted files and burn notices, coincidence was a myth. The moment she had put her hands on the high-value target in bed 1, her cover had evaporated. Staying at St. Jude's was no longer an option. It was a liability that would get innocent people killed. She looked at the file on the tray, then at the blood drying on her arms. She didn't reach for the paperwork. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She simply reached up and untied the surgical mask from behind her ears, letting it fall to her chest. "Is the bird hot?" Claire asked. Her voice had changed. The softness of the bedside manner was gone, replaced by a clipped, utilitarian cadence. "Rotors are spinning," Kane confirmed. "We have a secure site at Lewis McCord. Surgeons are standing by, but they don't know the protocol for this injury. You need to fly with him." Claire nodded once. She turned to the crash cart, grabbing a portable monitor and a bag valve mask. She moved with a sudden, terrifying authority that made Dr. Aris step back. She wasn't asking for permission to transfer the patient. She was commandeering him. "Let's move," she said to the tactical team. The operators didn't hesitate. 2 of them stepped forward, locking the gurney's wheels and lifting the chassis with practiced ease. They moved the patient toward the shattered sliding doors, their movements synchronized and fluid. Claire followed them, stepping over the threshold of the trauma bay. But before she walked out into the rotor wash, she stopped. She turned back to the room. The silence was absolute. The residents, the nurses, the orderlies, they were all staring at her as if she had just grown wings. Dr. Eris stood by the wall, his face a pale mask of confusion and bruised ego. He looked small now, stripped of the authority he wore like armor. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to issue one last futile order, but the words died in his throat. Claire met his eyes. There was no anger in her gaze, no vindication. There was only the cold, distant pity of a wolf looking at a house dog. "Watch his blood pressure," she said, pointing to the teenager in bed 3 she had treated earlier. "He's going to crash in 10 minutes if you don't hang a second unit." And then she turned away. The wind outside was a physical force. The Black Hawk waited on the pad like a crouching beast, its rotors slicing the gray sky. The noise was deafening, a screaming mechanical whine that vibrated in the chest. The operators loaded the gurney into the bay, securing the patient with rapid, practiced movements. Kane stood by the open door, his hand extended. Claire didn't take it. She hauled herself up into the cabin, her bloody scrubs stark against the dark metal of the fuselage. She knelt beside the patient, checking the improvised airway one last time, her hand steady against the vibration of the engine. Kane climbed in behind her and slid the heavy door shut. Inside the hospital, the sound muffled slightly, but the vibration remained. Dr. Eris walked slowly to the window, drawn by a force he couldn't name. He watched the massive black machine lift off. It didn't rise gently, it surged upward, nose down, aggressive and fast. It banked hard over the city, cutting through the smoke of the distant bridge collapse, and then it was gone, swallowed by the low clouds. The trauma bay was empty. The blood on the floor was still wet. The instrument tray still held the scalpel and the file labeled eyes only. Miller, the resident, walked over to the tray. He looked at the file, then at the spot where Claire had stood. Who was she? Miller whispered. Eris stared at the empty sky, the silence of the room rushing back in to fill the void left by the rotor wash. He realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that the woman who had saved 20 lives in 2 hours had never really been there at all. She was a ghost, Eris murmured. Claire just risked her entire life and freedom to save a stranger in 120 seconds. She gave up everything. All I'm asking you to give up is 1 second to hit that subscribe button. Don't leave her hanging in that helicopter. Like and comment, Extraction, if you want to see if she survives the flight, or keep scrolling if you want the bad guys to win.